Hey everyone, I'm excited to bring to you Eric Grant, who is you're you're a senior customer success manager, right? That's
That's
the
right.
official title.
Yep.
LinkedIn Learning. So we work together. He has an extensive learning and development background. He's also a writer, a Toastmaster, and just all around just an amazing guy. I always enjoy our conversations. You're always very supportive. You're thoughtful, and yeah, I'm excited to chat with you.
Cool. Thanks, Davidson. Excited to be here.
Yeah. So, I know like one of the things that you're into is writing, and I think a lot of people are like afraid of writing, or it's something that a lot of people want to do, and some people say they don't have time for it, or sometimes people have writer's block. Would love to learn a little bit more about your creative process.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think writing is a very uh, great instrument for people in just exploring however they want. So, even those that are scared and think that either they're not good enough writers or they just don't want to publish, what's great about that activity is there's still, I think, immense value in just writing for yourself, whether it's a diary or just getting notes out. There's a lot of science of just when we put pen to paper, what that does for our memory, our brain, our creative juices. So it's been something that's a big part of my life. I'm drawn to writers. I really love reading interviews and stories about writers. My favorite podcast is about writers, basically. And it's been a part of my life for since I was probably 14 or 15. I've been a pretty big reader even before that my whole life, but writing has really been that. And yeah, I've taken time off to write, have written throughout my life, of kind of up and down in volume and productivity, but I still have boxes of notebooks that I've filled over the years.
That's awesome. And it sounds like you write a lot of fiction as well, right?
Yeah, so some, yeah. At different times, I've written fiction. Right before we met, I took a year off to write a fiction book, a novel. I've written short stories before. I write essays for myself online, even half-written essays, and I write a lot of poetry just myself, but that doesn't really see the light of day. I don't really put that out there. But fiction is definitely a love of mine, and have done bouts of fiction writing for sure.
And so with poetry, like how do you often get your inspiration? Like is there a process behind that?
It depends. Rarely do I sit down to say, like, I'm going to write a poem right now. It usually comes from a couple lines that have been swirling around in my head, and then taking what those lines say or theme, or even just sometimes the sound of those lines and continuing out, whether it's a rhyme or something about those words. So, for whatever reason, when I'm, in my in like a completely present moment, that could be like walking around or in the shower or just like doing chores, and I'm not listening to any music or anything, my mind just starts writing, and that's either lines of poetry or writing fiction stories. That's just where my mind goes. So, you know, when I'm generally moving or on a train, like that's what's swirling around in my brain. And if I like what that is, I'll go home, I'll write it down. And rather than just write down, 3 lines, I'm like, I might as well just see where this goes and write 20 lines or 30 lines, or maybe sometimes only six. So sometimes the poems or even stories start off with a lot of energy and then just like fizzle out into nothing, but it's filling up my notebook. It's exercising my creativity. So there always seems to be like a positive reinforcement or feeling from doing it.
That's interesting. And I know you also meditate. So when you meditate, do you find that some of the inspiration and some of the things that are in your mind come up during meditation?
They do, and I try to separate that. I have in the past used meditation as a writing tool. I think when I first started, that was like the draw to it. Oh, I can, sit alone with my thoughts and then my words, but sometimes that wound up, getting in the way of the goal of writing, and the goal of meditation. So actually now, if I do sit down and meditate, I'll try to be present with the breath, even if writing, just like the rest of my daily thoughts come into my mind.
Hmm.
Um, But certainly when I was writing my book, and I had to think deeply about how to solve a writing problem. So how do I get this character to say or do this one thing that sets up a thematic element or the next scene? And I couldn't think of it. I would sit down and do something like a meditation of, no noise, silence, and just try to think through what I could do there. So something like that I still use as a tool if I need to.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's cool that like you can empower it if you want to, but then you're also aware that like, hey, I probably would get more out of it if I was just present like during this sacred time, right? So that's
Yeah.
interesting. Hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, man. How's your writing going?
It's actually like amazing. So I'm happy that I've bought a place because I think I'm gonna have like a like creative
Hmm.
loft where like it'll give me more creativity. So I'm gonna dedicate that room specifically for writing and like podcasting and more of my creative like inspiration.
Awesome.
That would be cool. I think this COVID time actually has helped me see that, oh, like I can write. I was never That was not part of my identity.
Mm,
So I think one of the cool things about working at LinkedIn is that it gives me LinkedIn is a little bit more friendly when it comes to like pursuing extracurricular activities, like whether it's podcasting or writing, where some companies, they kind of want separation of like, church and state, but I feel like
mhm.
LinkedIn is pretty good about pursuing like other side hobbies.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Um, yeah, and I know that, we're also part of Toastmasters as well. Would love to learn like what are some of like the takeaways you've gotten from doing that. It seems like you're always like putting yourself out there and you're always learning and growing, you're always evolving.
Yeah. It definitely came from that point. I think I like speakers and speeches and I guess, you know, persuasive influence and things like that. Um, it was a cool opportunity that LinkedIn had it, and I think I went to the first meeting just to scope it out. And I'd had a few friends who had done Toastmasters in the past and spoke highly of it. But as we've done it, and I've seen, how good some speakers are and what good speaking looks like, and then the small changes you can make to reducing ums and likes and how you frame things. It now fits into that kind of same thing of writing, which is how do you use words to send a message or create a feeling or persuade somebody. And speaking is a really great part of that. And this is my first job where I'm customer facing. I've always been internal. And so leading meetings for people that I, am meeting for sometime the first time or are not part of my company, or we don't have the immediate connection of just being internal at the same company. I felt like my presentation skills was something to work on. And so that is another great benefit of Toastmasters, is thinking about when I'm presenting to clients, using some of the things I've learned.
Yeah, it definitely does help a lot. I think for me, Toastmasters has helped me with my podcasting
Yeah,
a lot more
definitely.
awareness around the filler words. And clearly, I'm not perfect, but getting a little bit better every day, right? Slowly but surely.
Yeah, but I think the consciousness of self-evaluation is a huge benefit, right? Where you're, after I speak and I can look back and say, oh, I used and a few other things, or I spoke before I was ready to speak. So that conscious meta thought of how you're speaking is an amazing piece of learning from that stays. And so you can podcast and you can listen to yourself and say, here's something I'd like to change, or here's what I'm doing better than episode 1 or 5 or 10 or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like you're clearly like an intellectual. Like I guess like what do you think makes you so curious and just have like a thirst for learning? Like, what do you think that stemmed from?
Um, that's a great question. I don't I don't know where I can't point to a specific part it stemmed from. I can point to a few specifics of where I picked up writing and reading as a hobby. My parents were very encouraging about reading and are both very smart and read themselves. They both like history. We grew up as a family watching Jeopardy and quiz shows, so knowledge was always valued and something that I could use as a tool. Um, but I weirdly, I think now I was not a great student. And I think in a classroom setting, looking back at both high school and college, didn't have the learning appetite I do now. But post college, something clicked. And for the last, 10 years or so since I finished, I've been more voracious of wanting to learn than a lot of the peers that I see, out of school. And then getting into learning and development as a career and thinking about how other people learn has been an unlock to help me be a better learner, learning hacks, learning systems. And so it's kind of snowballed into being something, but learning is, or a learner is very much how I identify myself, and things like strength finders. And whenever I do those tests, the feedback I get from those is I love input. I love learning. I love reading things, sometimes to a little bit of an annoyance for some people, but yeah, yeah.
That's all. What are your strengths finders? What are like the
It
this?
was input was number one, learner was number two, and oof, I'd have to look up what number three was, but it was very much in the same vein. And I think it was interesting for me to also dissect the difference between input and learner and how those related. And I think input is actually correct as like I love getting lots of information. So the internet for me has been this amazing thing of I can find out anything I want, instantaneously. And, again, sometimes to a fault, like if I'm out or with people and something comes up that we don't know, I'm like the first person to bring my phone on and be like, I need to Google this. I'm not going to be happy not knowing this for the next 20 minutes. So it reaches those levels.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I think some people are definitely just much more like curious, and I definitely think like that's the cool thing about the anyone who works in LinkedIn Learning. Like we all have that mindset, so it's
Yeah.
you're like surrounding yourself with people like that.
Yeah. It's a huge benefit. And I think one of the biggest things I miss about the office was that we had such a good team curious to learn about our role and other things in the conversations. And we get those to a point, but we miss out on a lot of the connections of our team and surroundings, and like being in an environment where everybody's trying to learn and soak up a lot.
Yeah,
I know you
yeah,
I know you feel that. Yeah.
yeah. It's been challenging for sure. I was just like reflecting on like almost like the loss of like relating to the office as a human being, right? So if I was to talk to the human being, the LinkedIn New York office, I would talk to it like, hey, like I really miss you, like you like now I know how much like I took you for granted, and it's like
I
it's
like
silly,
that.
but it's helped me kind of like move on and get complete about it so that I'm not dwelling on it as much.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that exercise.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, what like what are you reading now? Or like what are some interesting things that, you've been up to? I'm sure with this time you're probably like pursuing other hobbies and, I'm sure you always have something going on.
Yeah. Definitely have some things going on. I decided a few months ago to try to work on my data skills a lot in the data science world. So I've been learning SQL and taking a online course now that's in R and analytics modeling, which is a really big challenge, but really exciting. I've liked that work so far. So that's consuming a lot of my time and a lot of the energy I have. Learning energy. Like really intense learning is really exhausting for us. So I could feel that taking up a lot of space. Um, Reading wise, right now I'm reading the autobiography that Oliver Sacks wrote on the move. If
Oh.
do you know who Oliver Sacks is?
I hear this book being recommended on Tim Ferriss podcast if you
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's got some crossover in that world. So he was um, I don't know. I don't even actually know what his exact role was. Neuroscientist, psychologist mix of some kind.
okay.
Really amazing thinker on the brain. He died a few years ago. and he wrote a couple famous books. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat was one. I think Awakenings is probably his most famous, and they made a movie about it, or movie of the book, with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. But he's got a great story. So I'm reading that and kind of soaking up from him. And then I've been on a little bit of a kick of New York books. So I moved to New York a year and 2 or 3 months ago. I read The Power Broker, which is like this 1,400 page monstrosity of a book about Robert Moses that took me forever to get through. And I read a book about the history of the New York subway. And I just read a book called The Alienist, which is a historical fiction in the 1890s about this murder mystery in New York. And I got a couple other New York books that are on the list. So I've been trying to, the history love of mine and information of getting a better grip on the history of New York and what the city's been all about, which is like
Hmm.
immensely fascinating.
Yeah, it is quite like when you take a step back to reflect on how much, like how integral like New York is just in the world and like
Yeah,
how much history it is kind of like mind blowing, right? Like just thinking about like there's so much. Like I remember I was watching a documentary about Penn Station and then I didn't realize it was this grand thing
yeah,
where they tore it down and built the, MSG on it. But before that, it was like a huge national landmark.
yeah, yeah. Even at Madison Square Garden before being a stadium was like a agora, Greek Roman style stadium that was much different than it looked like today. But yeah, New York is amazing. I mean, even in this fictional account, uh, in the 1890s, you have Teddy Roosevelt was the police commissioner of New York in the 1890s, and he goes on to be president and change the landmark. JP Morgan is in that book and setting up the early foundations of finance in New York and riches and wealth. You have union bosses who are creating like the first unions and unified workers movements. At the same time, you have Jacob Riis and others who are doing like this investigative journalism. So like even just this 1 2 year period in New York that book took place on, there's so many influential people in and around the city that are changing not just New York, but America and the world that, no other cities like that. So it's been amazing to read that.
That book kind of reminds me of the one about Chicago. What is it? The Devil.
Devil in the White City.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like one of my favorite books.
Yeah,
It's
it's great. I love that book. My girlfriend and I just listened to the audiobook last month,
hmm,
or this month. Uh, and it was amazing. And I'm from Chicago, so it was
uh,
amazing to get some more history on that, and have been
yeah.
to a few of the places they mentioned there. But yeah,
Yeah, it's I think Leonardo DiCaprio is doing like so
yeah.
that'd be good.
Supposedly they should make that. Yeah.
That'd be dope.
You ever think about leaving the New York? You grew up in New York, right? You've been here.
I mean, I guess not now. I just bought it,
Right.
and so
I guess growing up, when you were growing up in New York, did you always assume that you would live there as an adult?
no, that's the funny thing. So I grew up like closer to Philly, so I was
Oh, okay.
more loyal to Philly.
Gotcha. I didn't know that.
Actually, I remember at one point I was like, I would never live in New York. Just the Philly pride talking, right?
Yeah,
It was just like, ah, like New Yorkers are like they're cocky, they think they like own everything. They're
yeah,
like, like I was just like being a young teenager
right.
and here I am, I lived 5 years now. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah, the one thing like what do you like most about New York? Like it seems like you're really into like the history and just like all the so much has like been created from New Yorkers. But like what do you think
Yeah,
makes New York like unique?
yeah. I mean, the history is untouchable, certainly compared to uh, American cities, and probably only a few cities in the world can really talk about the broad influence. But I think the coolest thing about New York for me is that people can be whoever and whatever they want, regardless of age and a lot of other factors that limit that in a lot of other places. I think a lot of other cities, get further trapped into the tribe mentality, and people adopt closer to the norm. And certainly cities have different, groups of people and movements going on. But New York seems to hold a, a more diverse group of those groups, and then allow for a much more supportive coexistence, maybe. And maybe that's optimistic. Like I don't, you know, I'm still in New York. My exposure to New York City and New Yorkers is still very small. Um,
Mm.
but from the outside, or at least just taking like a positive encouragement, is could walk down the street of Manhattan and hear seven languages and see people that are radically different in dress and expression and age and who they want to be. Um, you know, I've traveled a lot, and I don't find that in a lot of other cities.
What that's a good yeah, I definitely agree with you there. What are some like other fun cities that you've been through? So I feel like I haven't traveled that much. So for me, like that's one of my goals in life to travel more.
Yeah,
Would love to hear like, you know, your some of your like experiences and some of these other cool places you've been.
for sure. Well, I don't know if we've talked about my, um, I guess my journey here, but to kind of do it briefly. So I finished school, and I moved to South Korea for a year to teach. So I lived right outside Seoul, which was amazing, and love Korea and Korean culture, Korean food. Really had an amazing time there. Got to travel around Asia while I was there for the year on different vacations. And then I came back to the States after a year and didn't have a job or a place to go and wasn't going to stick around at my parents' house. So I actually moved to New Orleans, and stayed there for a little while. Um, that was amazing. New Orleans is absolutely one of a kind city, and to be like a 23-year-old with little responsibility there was just a ton of fun, and was there during festival season and all that. And after New Orleans, I moved to San Diego for a little while. And after San Diego, I moved like right on the beach, which was another kind of dream of mine. And then I moved to San Francisco. And for 4 years, my first job that I had, where I was really kind of learning and development as a role and career, it was a virtual company. It was all online, all remote. Kind of before that was like a big thing, as we're going to start to see it become now. And that experience certainly has helped me. But it didn't matter where I was, so I could live in San Diego or San Francisco. Or what I did was I'd go to South America in the winter for 4 months or so. To Went to Costa Rica one year, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, all around, and then I'd come back to North America, and I spent a summer in Vancouver. I spent some time in Chicago. I'd spent a little time in New York. So I've actually kind of had a lot of travel, which I feel, you know, a huge benefit of. And before starting LinkedIn and moving to New York, I did another year of travel where I didn't work. I left my job in Chicago, went to Asia, went to Korea again for a little while, and Asia all around for 6 months, and then spent 4 months in Mexico City, and then moved to New York. So a lot of cool cities. I love Mexico City. I love Vancouver. I think those are cool cities. I love Seoul. I don't know if I live Seoul, you know, full time, but um, yeah, a lot of favorite places along the way.
What was it about? I heard Mexico City's beautiful, but what was it like there?
Yeah, I mean, it's Mexico City is massive for one. You kind of get a little contained, as a foreigner, as a white person, and my Spanish was passable, but you know, not fluent or great. But Mexico City is beautiful. The center part of the city, and the wealthier parts of the city where fortunately I got to be, are very European, very green. There's a lot of people from all over the world coming around. It's walkable, it's warm, it's cheap. The food is great. You could just get, you know, street tacos for $3 for $1.
Wow.
It was a good place to go as a broke writer, and write and be inspired by art and culture, and the history of Mexico City is also really fascinating too. And I met some friends down there, and some locals who were just incredibly kind, and um, yeah, positive people.
That's awesome. And you know, Korea, I'm sure was so different. What can like Americans learn, like take away one takeaway from like Korean culture?
Oh, um, hmm. One takeaway from Korean culture. You know, I, that's interesting. I think it wouldn't be schools, but schooling is something that comes to mind because the South Korea is so serious about schooling to a fault. I think that there's a con side to this. But my students were prepared. I taught high schoolers, prepared, respectful for the most part, um, very intelligent and very serious. And high school there is more of an approximation of your success in life than college, where as much as we'd like to think it's not, that's reversed in America, and
Huh.
I'd like to see that disrupted. But college, where you go to college is, let me just say that again. In high school determines where you go to college, which then kind of determines it. But a lot of the work is done in high school. But I think the way that they treat teachers in the education system, which they draw back to sort of the Confucian ideas of a teacher's place in society, I would like to see that in America. I think we take the role of teachers way too much for granted and really underestimate the power of a really good teacher somebody can have, the power of a teacher that doesn't care about their students and how destructive that can be, and just how much of a carrier the teacher is of a student's success over a year, which if you're 9, 10, 11 years old is crucial to your development. um, and maybe it takes something like this for us to realize how important teachers are and classrooms are, but I wish it didn't. And yeah, teachers are very well respected in their culture. As a teacher coming in, and me being able to tell shop owners, and they kind of assumed, a lot of the Americans and Westerners there are English teachers, was treated very well and was thanked and was given gifts, and students bowed to you, and people just saw your importance, not for what you were giving back to the community. That's important.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think, teachers, well, I think the pay has something to do with it. Obviously, teachers aren't like paid that well, right? So I
Mhm.
think naturally the top performers will gravitate more towards like high paying roles. I mean,
Yep.
this is a big generalization, but I'm sure some of those, like if teachers were paid more, they would be more likely to want to be a
Mhm.
teacher,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I do think like our education system is so, is not great. I do think America does a great job of fostering like innovation and like independence and things like that. But I do think because we're so independent and we're so like egocentric, that's probably why we have like the biggest COVID crisis as well, right? Because
Yeah.
people were less likely to think about the collective whole.
Yep.
So the average American is very egocentric.
Yeah, and a country like South Korea did very well, handling the virus, and continues to as they have outbreaks, and a lot has to do with some of their culture and systems. But just going back to the teacher thing, I know I'm not. This is not my thought. I'm stealing this from somewhere. But if you think back to your favorite courses that you took in school, oftentimes that goes to who the professor was, or teacher was. And then if you think of not even classes, but subjects that you didn't like or didn't excel in. I think of things like biology, which I'm like, I don't like biology. It's almost directly related to who the teacher was, not as a person, but just how they approached their job teaching. And I had a biology teacher I didn't get along with, and I didn't respect that much, and I don't think just cared about me or other students. And
Mm.
that's reflected now, which is crazy to think about, in like a field of science of studying, life. It has nothing to do, but you see like that role has a lasting impact.
Yeah, you're right. I remember not being really into history because I had a history teacher who was like an asshole,
There
to
you go.
be honest. And then I went to college and I took this American government course, which I would think would be like the most boring course ever. But the professor was so interesting that
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, now I'm like really fascinated by history. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how much of an impact like one person can have. Because I think when you're younger, you're so malleable, right? And I think you're an anomaly in the sense that you still have like that childlike curiosity. But I think for the most part, most people, right, tend to, be okay with kind of like trusting what they see in mainstream media. And I mean, I think they're just not even aware, right? I
Yeah.
don't think intentional. I think, just going with the flow and then, there's like a lack of, I think because when you graduate from college, there's no one's like forcing you to go to school, so naturally people just aren't really making as much of an effort.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Huh. How does one, what do you think, because I do think, man, do you hear that thunder?
Yeah, yeah. Is that what that was?
Easy. Wow.
Yeah.
What do you think, like what's something like people that have kids, or people that like, because I do think, like, when you have a family and stuff like that, that's when people tend to kind of stop doing some of their passions, their hobbies.
Yeah.
And I think someone can do that, maybe they feel like they have all these obligations, they don't have time to write, or they don't have time to read, and to do all of these things that they're passionate about.
Yeah. Uh, Um, it's a hard question for me to answer. I have time for myself, and I don't have a family. I live with my girlfriend, and certainly want to set aside time for us. But um, things I've done, and then I'll kind of give a piece of advice if it's at all warranted or trusted. I'd start cutting, if you can, cutting out things that aren't adding value. I didn't watch television for 2 years, and I told people that I watch movies. I love movies, but I wouldn't watch a TV show, just to some annoyance. And sometimes I'd get on a high horse about it, of like, well, like TV is just wasting your time and all that. But really what it was for me is just an elimination, because TV was not only so good, but so watchable, and so watchable for hours, that if I didn't cut it out, I would just watch, like binge watch something.
Mm.
Movies kind of helped me because they always had an end, and I don't really watch a lot of movies with sequels, but even then, like there aren't even that many movies with sequels, I guess. I don't know.
Hmm.
But it just felt like when you're done, you're done. And I watched my movie, and now I can move on, where TV can kind of suck you in. But I did that. And I did that almost entirely to create time for reading and writing, and other things, even watching more movies. I think for those that are struggling on the time, just think about one thing you'd want to focus on. And so instead of writing, I want to write, you know, about one thing, my day, my life, a diary entry. And then, as with all habit building, and this, you just start small. So say I want to write 3 lines of something every day. And once you write those 3 lines and you have a few extra minutes, you'll write 7 lines and 12 lines and 15 lines. And if you don't, you write your three and you're done. It's like, weightlifting. And there's just like, you just get to the gym, and then you'll just start naturally working out if you just make the goal to get there. And reading, I'd say to as best you can, to find a trusted recommender, so you're not feeling intimidated by just how many books there are out there if you are a reader, and just try to take a few chosen or recommended books by somebody you trust to read. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, I think too often we take on whatever, and then we're not as thoughtful about where we allocate our time. I've been guilty of saying yes to too many things just because I'm like, oh, like I feel bad saying no. But I think the older we get, the more we realize, like, hey, time is limited.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna do something and you're not really gonna be 100% present because you kind of don't want to be there, like, it's better just to say no.
Yeah. I mean, you're as voracious of a reader as I know. Do you commit to a certain amount of time of reading every day, or pages, or it's just when you have time you do it?
I try to do, like, my more recent habit is like every time I wake up like early in the morning. So for some reason, I guess my natural body just been waking up early. So every time I wake up earlier than I normally would, I'll just read. So
Mm,
it's like the first thing I do in the morning, just because like it's
nice.
like the thing that drives me the most, or gives me like the most fulfillment. So when I read, I typically do it in the mornings. And then I think when I have my own place, like I'll probably be reading even more, because I think in New York City, like you do have like the ability to go out and stuff. But I
Yeah.
think I'm actually excited to kind of like go back to the suburbs, because I think I'll have more time to read, because there's so many books that I haven't read yet that I want to. So I think I've bought like 1,000 books, and probably 500 of them I haven't read yet. So
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Those are both very impressive numbers anyway. Do you have any fiction on the list yet?
I used to be, the funny thing is I used to be really into fiction,
Oh, interesting.
and I'm actually like writing, like thinking about writing like fiction because I think it's such a cool thing. But I was like really into like Redwall, the series.
Yeah, sure.
I was like that I was so addicted to that. And then Ender's Game was like
Hmm.
the whole series was like amazing.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I was into it like when I was younger, but I think somewhere along the way, I think I kind of lost like some of my childhood. I think so. I think my one friend, who this guy who I respect, like he's very wealthy. Like I think one day he was just like, "Yeah, Davidson, like stop playing so much video games. Like you gotta grow up. Like like you gotta like mature." And then I think I took his feedback to the extreme where like I stopped like doing like things that I would that's like not adult things. So
Okay.
now that I'm older, a little bit more mature, and like I see like okay, like that's I don't have to worry about that anymore. But I remember
Yeah.
like his feedback so like viscerally.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's probably good feedback in totality of just motivating you to get a lot of other things on track and in your life. But I've had conversations and I've tried in the past, and many other thinkers and professors and writers who can do this better for me. But I think there's a really compelling argument to be made for fiction for adults, and even for those that are, you know, heavy nonfiction readers, where you're like, my goal of reading is to learn, grow, take advice from amazing thinkers or writers or their stories, people that are changing the world and absorbing that. There's both a scientific of like the neural pathways you create with fiction, because you have to construct entirely new worlds.
Mm.
There's like the understanding of human drama. There's the emotional part. There's like these multifaceted things that people have formed that makes the argument that it's actually a more adult
Mm.
activity to read fiction. I don't know, of all kinds or what it is, but to read these things and how you respond than to read anything else. So that's out there.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think like I think imagination is like such a good like because I think at the end of the day, because especially even during like a time like now, right? Like we're always working, we're closer to the laptop. There because people aren't commuting, like you're more likely to
Yeah,
more. So I think you also like outside of the benefits you said with like creativity and all that, I think just being able to just escape, right? Because sometimes
yeah,
it's exhausting, like having to answer client emails and doing all this. So sometimes you just want to be able to like get teleport to like a fantasy world. So for me, I think I watch like a lot of like sci-fi. So maybe that's kind of how I fulfilled that
totally.
like Doctor Who and stuff like that. Like really into that.
Yeah, yeah. That I imagine that fills a lot, and TV's gotten so good at creating stories and compelling things that um, I think it equalizes some of what you get from fiction. The difference is the written word just requires more mental strength to carry on that world that you've created neurally, like throughout the whole book. And that's why people have this very visceral feeling when they close a book that they're really into, that you're losing a friend, or you feel grief of loss of the character or the world that was in it, or the escapism you got from it. But um, seeing that is pretty amazing. And um, yeah, I always just I wish people, I wish there were less judgment on what you read fiction wise, and I'm very guilty of that myself in the past and trying to work on that myself. But just to encourage adults, I think right now the average American reads like zero point 0.9 books per year, and I'd really like to see that get be a little bit higher.
It's
Um,
crazy.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's not even getting into poetry and how much I think poetry can be a salve for current woes and things right now. So. That's just the fiction part.
Huh. Uh, have you heard of a guy named he does like deaf poetry uh Q NQ NQ
Mm,
NQ.
no, but
Oh,
I'll check it out.
I feel like you would love his. So he has a way of communicating like all of like what's going on from like Black Lives Matters to and he's a white dude, right? But some of his poetry is so like deep, and like he has one I remember where he talks about like being a father and having a child, and he goes into like this whole like detailed about like what it's like to be a father, and then at the end he's like, but I wouldn't know because I've never had kids, you know. And
Wow.
I feel like you would like his poetry. It's very like deep and very like, yeah, it's touching, and it's like
Cool.
all unique. Like all his poetry is like completely different. One is like completely different than the other.
Amazing. I'll check it out. It's just the letters NQ.
Uh, it's like in Q.
In Q.
Yeah, like inquire within, but it's like
Okay.
in and then Q.
Cool. I'll check it out.
Yeah,
Thanks for
really
that.
really inspiring guy. Um, yeah, well, this has been a really interesting conversation. What I got from it was that like, you know, just maintain that childlike wonder, and also just not being afraid to just travel and just do things, right? I think a lot of times we're afraid of, you know, we travel like, you know, others might be like, what is he doing? Or, you know, I don't know. I think too often we think about like how others would perceive us. Like, you know, the fact that you took off for a year and traveled the world, like some people might be like, oh, like, what is he doing? He had this
Hmm.
awesome job, you know?
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
it seems like you are very like aware of of what you enjoy, and you act upon it.
Yeah. I appreciate that summation. I agree. There's been some missteps and things along the way. I think you risk that taking a journey into the unknown, but um, overall, I think that's accurate. I think the wonder thing is big. I've done a lot of writing, especially many years ago when I was younger, about the idea of wonder, and that I kind of keep that with me sometimes.
And I mean, if you don't mind sharing, what are some of those missteps? Now I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, like I think for one, I think travel gave me a lot of amazing things. I got to see a lot of cool cities. I got to see a lot of places. I got to have a lot of alone time. I got to learn how to be alone, which like if I could offer that as a skill to people, not ever, I think a lot of people could benefit from that. That's a fear for a lot of people. To the opposite of that, what the risk is you relationships. I spent a lot of time being lonely or feeling lonely while I was traveling. I didn't necessarily lose friendships because I traveled, but because I wasn't there, the strength of those friendships surely slipped. And I still have some great friendships that I'm grateful for, but I have lost touch with people along the way, or just by proxy of not being in a location, you start to um, lose some tightness in friendship, and certainly romantic relationships in my early years were sacrificed because I just didn't live anywhere. I was literally just moving around all the time. I'm sure I could have planned money better. I'm sure I could have made some career moves, or might have sacrificed some things by wanting to, there were some opportunities that came up where I turned them down or didn't take them because I knew I'd be moving or traveling. Um, and then, yeah, just some changing goals too. Like even in writing a book, I had to really reckon with why am I doing this? Is this worth the sacrifices? What do I want out of it? And then kind of coming to terms, if I didn't get it published, okay, what did that mean? Didn't even try to get it published, okay, what does that mean? um, just thinking about those. So nothing that's thrown my life off. I'm very, very grateful to be where I am today, and I think I've been strength. Like the overall equation or some of my actions is definitely positive. But I think like anytime you step out into an unknown, you take a risk, and you just gotta be okay with that, and reckon with what it means later.
Yeah, that's a huge takeaway. Being able to mm, make decisions that can be hard. I think sometimes take the most people take the easier path, right? It seems like you've often taken the road less traveled, right? As you.
Yeah, and just to like try to be aware on this. I mean, that comes with an immense amount of privilege to be able to take a harder road seemingly, but to have the support from a loving family and the financial situation to be able to do it. Like it would be you know, I'd cover up a lot if I just said like, oh, I earned my own way and I took the hard road the whole time. There's a lot of amazing people and factors that allowed me to do that. I never necessarily thought about, yeah, something of a road less traveled in a way, or just a road that I didn't even know could be there, that I'm just like, let's just see what happens. Let's just go here.
Hmm. That's yeah, that's pretty deep. And then you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but being that you are like a white male, right? What many would be considered living in the US, like
Hmm.
the privilege, right? What advice would you give to people who want to be able to like, give back or learn more about maybe those who like aren't as privileged? It could be anything in regards to race or just giving back to the community. It seems like you're like a pretty open-minded person and you're always like looking for ways to like help out others.
Yeah. Um, I'm happy you asked. I'm definitely still a student myself in that. Like I'm not leading a crusade of the change that I want to, like I'm participating in the change I want to see, I hope, but I'm not at the forefront, and I have a lot to learn and develop to either be at the forefront or to push it more. Um, my best weapon, and this goes back to some themes here, is just education. And I think to be a participant in the changes in this country around race, in the world around colonialism and brutality, like history, I know it's a trope to say this, but history is really important. The context you get, the stories, the way and reason things are the way they are. Um, it's just that's the best road I can go down. So when it comes to trying to make change, the first thing I do is try to learn, and read and turn my curiosity toward, you know whatever that subject's going to be. And I try to do that personally, professionally, and keep up with changes I'd like to see.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway, right? I think there's such like you mentioned, there's like an abundance of information out there, and you literally have the world at your fingertips, right? Through like a smartphone, through internet search, through whatever it is. Like we just have so much access now. So take I would say one of the biggest takeaways from our conversation is like just don't be afraid to follow your curiosity, and whether that looks like moving to another city or taking another job that you might be curious about but you're comfortable in your own job right now, right? It sounds like that's when you've had like the most transformative experiences, and some of these amazing stories that you can share with your friends and family. So
Yeah,
yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, I really appreciate you. I know you're always super supportive of this
yeah,
podcast and you're always like supporting all of my ventures, and I really appreciate your friendship. And yeah, you do mean like a lot to me because like, we started together like around
mhm,
the same time, and it's awesome to it's awesome to live life and know like you have people like you around that's always like supportive, who's always like cheering for you. So really appreciate you, Eric.
yeah. That's I mean, unbelievably kind to say, and very appreciative. I will return the compliments and just say how like proud I am of you to see you get to episode 72, 73 of this podcast, and to push yourself to be better every time you do it, and like just take on that interview of all these people. And the people you've gotten have been amazing, by the way. The guests and networking that you've done to do it is, I started listening to be supportive of a friend, and really to try to, um, yeah, encourage people in my network to create, which is something I love. And now, I listen now for information and growth, not just, out of a compelling to be a positive support system. So, you're in my podcast cycle, and I learn from each episode, and proud of you for that, and just blown away by the immense amount of good that you do in your community around you, whether it's LinkedIn and LinkedIn Asian Alliance, or the nonprofits that you do. So it's a really a pleasure to be your friend as well, and to see that.
Yeah, honestly, like you helped me a lot because, like with anything creative, right? Sometimes you have days where you're like, oh, I kind of don't feel like it,
Yeah,
right? But when you have people like you and Edwin who are like extremely supportive, like it really helps me know, like, you know what? Like trust the process. Like I'm getting better. Like maybe that last episode wasn't that great. Maybe I stuttered a lot, but at the end of the day, when you have these like people that are by your side, it definitely helps me, move forward. So thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
you're welcome. Thanks for having me on this. This was a blast.